Good afternoon. My name is Charlie Baum, and today we're going to begin talking about elasticities. This lecture is going to talk about the qualitative characteristics of elasticities. We're going to talk about factors that tend to increase or decrease the price elasticity of demand for a good or service. We're going to be looking at a list of 5 factors in particular that affect price elasticity of demand. The first factor on this list is going to be the availability of close substitutes. First of all, let me remind you that if the price elasticity of demand for a good is relatively elastic, then that means consumers are relatively sensitive to price. If there's a price change, consumers will dramatically change the quantity of a good or service that they demand. If the price elasticity of demand is relatively inelastic, then consumers are relatively insensitive to price changes. So that if the price does change, consumers won't change the quantity of a good that they demand by very much. Now, getting back to our list of 5 factors that affect the price elasticity of demand. The first factor is the availability of close substitutes. If a good has a lot of substitutes, then consumers are going to tend to be relatively sensitive to price changes, which will make the price elasticity of demand for that product relatively elastic. And the reason is because lots of substitutes exist, so that if the price of that good goes up, consumers can replace their consumption of that good with lots of other goods. Just the opposite, gasoline is an example of a good that does not have many substitutes. Most of us have vehicles that will only run on gasoline. Since gasoline does not have many substitutes available, consumers cannot be particularly sensitive to the price of gasoline. And so as a result, the price elasticity of demand for gasoline tends to be relatively inelastic. But if you consider Nike shoes, they have many close substitutes available. For example, shoes by Reebok or Adidas. As a result, consumers are relatively sensitive to the price of Nikes because there are many substitutes available. The second factor on our list is going to be the passage of time. The price elasticity of demand tends to be more elastic the longer the time horizon. This is because over a longer period of time, consumers have more time to adjust and change their behavior. Over a shorter time period, consumers may not have time to change their behavior in response to a price change. For example, the price elasticity of demand for gasoline over the next year is likely much more elastic than the price elasticity of demand for gasoline tomorrow. This is because over the course of the next year, consumers have time to change their behavior. In response to an increase in the price of gasoline, consumers have time to buy a more fuel-efficient car or perhaps even move closer to work. The price elasticity of demand for gasoline tomorrow is much more inelastic because consumers don't have time to change their behavior. The third factor on our list has to do with whether the good is a luxury or a necessity. The price elasticity of demand for necessities is relatively inelastic. Consumers can't be particularly sensitive to the prices of necessities because, by definition, consumers need those goods. Examples might be milk and bread. Consumers would view milk and bread typically as necessities, and so the price elasticity of demand for those goods tends to be relatively inelastic. But a luxury might be a Caribbean cruise. It's something you don't have to have. And as a result, the price elasticity of demand for cruises is relatively elastic. If the price changes, consumers are likely to be relatively sensitive to that price change because they don't have to go on a Caribbean cruise. The fourth item on our list has to do with the way the market is defined. If the market is defined very, very narrowly, then the price elasticity of demand will tend to be relatively elastic. And if the market is drawn very, very broadly, then the price elasticity of demand will tend to be relatively inelastic. And here's why. If the market is drawn very narrowly, then this leaves more other goods available as substitutes. But if the market is drawn very, very broadly, then this leaves fewer other goods available as substitutes. For example, the price elasticity of demand for Marlboro cigarettes is likely much more elastic than the price elasticity of demand for all cigarettes. Marlboro cigarettes have many substitutes, such as Camel cigarettes or Winston cigarettes. But substitutes for all cigarettes begin to look very different. They begin to look like things like cigars or pipes or gum. The fifth factor on our list that affects the price elasticity of demand is the share of expenditures in a consumer's budget on that good. If the good represents a relatively small share of the consumer's budget, then consumers won't be particularly sensitive to its price, and the price elasticity of demand will be relatively inelastic. But if the good represents a relatively large share of the consumer's budget, then consumers will be more sensitive to prices, the price of that good, and the price elasticity of demand will tend to be relatively elastic. For example, table salt is a good that you probably only buy once or twice a year and it doesn't cost much. As a result, consumers aren't particularly sensitive to the price of salt, and the price elasticity of demand for salt is likely relatively inelastic. But housing represents a large portion of a consumer's budget, and so consumers are likely relatively sensitive to the price of housing. So the price elasticity of housing tends to be relatively elastic.